Hey everyone, welcome back. This week we are moving into two of the most important foundational concepts in assessment and testing, which is reliability and validity. These concepts show up everywhere in counseling assessment, whether we're talking about depression screenings, suicide assessments, ADHD evaluations, personality inventories, career assessments, trauma measures, or even academic testing. One of the first questions we should be asking ourselves is, can I even trust this tool? And if I can trust it, what exactly does the score actually mean? Today, we're focusing specifically on reliability and validity, and we're intentionally separating this lecture from understanding assessment scores and statistics because I want us first to understand the quality of the assessment itself before we move on to score interpretation later. So, by the end of this lecture, you should be able to define reliability and validity, differentiate between major types of reliability and validity, and understand how measurement error impacts assessment, think critically about assessment tools in real counseling settings, and apply multicultural and ethical thinking to test interpretation. And honestly, my hope is that this lecture helps you become more thoughtful consumers of assessments rather than simply people who administer tests because they exist. So I want to start with a simple example. Imagine stepping on a bathroom scale 3 different times within the same hour and getting these results: 142 pounds, 176 pounds, and 119 pounds. And most people would immediately think something is wrong with this scale. Why? Because the measurement is inconsistent. Now, imagine a different scenario. You step on a scale 5 times, and every single time it says 150 pounds. Very consistent, very stable. But then you discover that the scale is actually calibrated incorrectly and always reads 15 pounds too high. Now we have consistency without accuracy. And that's the difference between reliability and validity. Reliability asks, is the tool consistent? Validity asks, is the tool measuring what it claims to measure? And this distinction matters in counseling because assessment results influence diagnoses, treatment planning, educational placement, medication referrals, access to accommodations, insurance reimbursement, court decisions, and sometimes how clients begin to understand themselves. And a poorly designed or poorly interpreted assessment can genuinely impact somebody's life. So before we define reliability and validity more deeply, we need to understand measurement error. No psychological assessment is perfect. Every score contains some degree of error. In assessment theory, people sometimes talk about a true score versus an observed score. The observed score is what we actually get on the assessment. The true score is the person's actual level of the trait that we're trying to measure. Those are rarely identical, and the difference between them is called measurement error. Now, there's two types of measurement error. There's systematic error and unsystematic error. Systematic error is consistent distortion. This usually becomes more of a validity issue. An example would be a situation where an assessment result suggests mania when the actual issue is substance use. Clinically, we see this kind of thing all of the time. So, for example, trauma symptoms being mistaken for borderline personality disorder, or ADHD being mistaken for anxiety, or grief being mistaken for depression, or culturally normative guardedness being interpreted as paranoia, or like in the picture, maybe centimeters being confused for inches or vice versa. So the assessment may consistently produce the same interpretation, but the interpretation itself may be flawed, and that becomes a validity problem. Unsystematic error is more random and inconsistent. Examples might include the client didn't sleep, the room was noisy, the client was distracted, the counselor rushed administration, scoring errors occurred, rapport was poor, or the client misunderstood the instructions. And this kind of inconsistency impacts reliability. And this is important because counseling assessments do not happen in sterile laboratory conditions. They happen in schools, in clinics, in hospitals, in community mental health settings, in addiction treatment, during crises, and with tired, overwhelmed, traumatized human beings. Context matters. See you on the screen, huh? Okay. So, put my camera on real fast so that you can see I'm watching my friend's dog. Hi, TJ. And he really wanted to cuddle. So if you hear grunts or moaning, I swear it's not me, but you can take a look at this good little boy while I'm talking. So when we're talking about reliability and validity, here's how these concepts are going to be different. Reliability refers to consistency, and if the assessment is repeated under similar conditions, do we get similar results? Validity refers to whether the assessment measures what it claims to measure. And here's the important question students often struggle with. Can a test be reliable but not valid? Yes, it can be. A broken clock that is stuck at 3 o'clock is perfectly consistent. It gives the same answer every time, but it's still wrong, right? I know. I know. So reliability alone is not enough. And generally speaking, reliability is necessary for validity, but reliability does not guarantee validity. So there are three major forms of reliability that we are going to discuss today: temporal reliability, internal consistency, and inner rater or inner scorer reliability. And each one asks a different question about consistency. Temporal reliability asks, does the assessment produce similar results over time? And there are two major ways that this is examined: test and retest reliability and parallel forms reliability. Test and retest reliability involves administering the same test multiple times and comparing the results. So, for example, imagine administering a depression inventory on Monday and then again on Wednesday. If nothing substantial has changed, we would expect the scores to remain relatively similar. But there are some limitations. One issue is called the memory effect. Clients may remember previous responses, and this is especially relevant for suicide screenings, trauma inventories, personality measures, and ADHD screeners. So clients may consciously or unconsciously repeat previous answers. And this becomes even more complicated clinically because people actually do change. Mood changes, stress changes, life changes. So reliability is never interpreted in a vacuum. Parallel forms reliability uses two different versions of the same assessment. So for example, version A and version B on an academic test. And the goal is to determine whether both forms produce similar outcomes. One challenge here is something called the practice effect. If somebody has already taken a similar assessment once, they may perform differently simply because they're familiar with the format. This happens often in educational testing or neuropsychological testing or ADHD evaluations or repeated substance use screenings. So internal consistency asks, are the items on the assessment measuring the same underlying construct? So here's a metaphor. Imagine a Spotify playlist titled Relaxing Acoustic Music. Sounds really nice. But maybe halfway through the playlist, death metal starts playing. Yeah, TJ. Something feels inconsistent. The pieces no longer fit together, and that's similar to what happens when assessment items are not actually being measured with the same construct. So I pulled up the Beck anxiety inventory on your slide, and it should primarily measure anxiety. But if several items accidentally measure unrelated things like maybe extroversion or physical fitness, then the scale loses internal consistency. Now, these actually are the questions for the Beck anxiety inventory, but see how you could maybe see how some of them might be asking about anxiety symptoms or maybe symptoms other than that too. Maybe it leans a little into PTSD or neuropathy, or did the client even eat today? Or when was the last time they had any water? Or were they physically active earlier? Or are they sunburned? All of these things are going to show up in an assessment a little bit differently, and that's why we use multiple tools and clinical judgment and not just exam results. So you will often see reliability discussed statistically using something called a reliability coefficient. And usually these values range between 0 and 1. Higher values generally indicate stronger consistency. And you'll also frequently encounter a term called Cronbach's alpha. You do not need to become statisticians for this course, but I do want you to recognize the terminology because you will absolutely see it in journal articles and assessment manuals. So in simple terms, Cronbach's alpha is one way that researchers estimate internal consistency. And generally speaking, higher alpha values suggest that the items are functioning cohesively together. So inner score reliability, sometimes called inner rater reliability, asks, if multiple professionals score or interpret the same material, do they reach similar conclusions? And this becomes especially important when scoring involves subjectivity. So examples might be behavioral observations, autism assessments, projective measures, interview-based assessments, or clinical risk evaluations. So maybe think about the Olympic judges. If 5 judges were to watch the same gymnastics routine and all give radically different scores, we would question the reliability of the scoring process. And the same principle applies in counseling assessment. We generally want the inner raters or all of the raters to rate similarly. So one of the things that we want to ask is which type of reliability is most appropriate for the situation. So let's simplify this. If the assessment is repeated over time, temporal reliability matters. If the assessment is intended to measure one construct, internal consistency matters. If interpretation or scoring is subjective, inner rater reliability matters. And this helps counselors think critically about what kind of consistency actually matters for the tool that they are using. So I want you to think about how reliability isn't going to be enough. We're going to talk about validity next. So, again, reliability asks whether the tool's consistent. Validity asks whether the tool is measuring what it claims to measure. And validity is ultimately about meaning. What conclusions are we drawing from the assessment? And are those conclusions actually justified? So, when we talk about types of validity, face validity is one of the most intuitive forms of validity. It simply asks, does the assessment appear to measure what it claims to measure? So, for example, a depression inventory asking about sadness, hopelessness, energy, sleep problems, that has a fairly strong face validity. We would expect a depression inventory to ask about symptoms of depression. But imagine a depression inventory asking, so how sad do blue M&Ms make you feel? And that would likely seem a little strange and a little disconnected. Face validity is not the strongest scientific form of validity. But it does matter because clients respond differently to assessments that feel meaningful versus confusing or irrelevant. I think TJ might be done with this. Are you done, TJ? I'm covered in fur. Are we gonna eat down? Okay. TJ is tired of this, and that means you probably are too. So I'll try to go a little more quickly. Okay, and then content validity asks, does the assessment adequately represent the domain it's supposed to measure? And a good metaphor here is a final exam. So imagine taking a semester-long course where the final exam only covers one chapter. Even if the questions are accurate, the exam does not adequately represent the full content area. In counseling, we might see poor content validity when a trauma assessment only asks about physical violence, or an addiction assessment ignores behavioral addictions, or a depression measure overlooks cultural expressions of distress. This is where multicultural thinking becomes essential, because assessments are shaped by the assumptions of the people who created them. And then in construct validity, that's often considered one of the most important forms of validity. A construct is a psychological concept that cannot be directly observed. Examples include depression, anxiety, intelligence, self-esteem, resilience. We cannot directly measure these things the way that we measure height or temperature. Instead, we measure indicators that are assumed to represent the construct. And construct validity asks, is the assessment actually measuring the psychological concept that it claims to measure? Then there's convergent and discriminant validity. Two important pieces of construct validity are convergent validity and discriminant validity. So convergent validity means measures that should relate actually do relate. So for example, a depression inventory should correlate with hopelessness or low self-esteem. Discriminant validity means that measures that should not strongly relate actually remain separate. So for example, a depression inventory should not strongly correlate with mathematical ability. These concepts help researchers determine whether an assessment is actually capturing the intended construct instead of something unrelated. And then criterion validity asks, does the assessment relate meaningfully to important real-world outcomes? There are two major forms, concurrent validity and predictive validity. Concurrent validity means the assessment aligns with other current indicators. So an example of this would be a new anxiety screening producing similar results to an already established anxiety measure. Predictive validity asks whether the assessment predicts future outcomes. Examples could be SAT scores predicting college performance, suicide risk assessments predicting future risk, relapse risk assessments predicting treatment outcomes. And this is where counseling assessments become consequential, because sometimes major clinical decisions are being informed by these tools. So moving on to multicultural and ethical considerations, it's just incredibly important in counseling. An assessment can be highly reliable and still create harm if it was never designed for the population being assessed. So we need to think about norm groups, language differences, disability accommodations, cultural meaning of symptoms, access issues, historical misuse of testing, bias in interpretation. And some of these examples could include ADHD assessments developed primarily on boys. They're not necessarily going to measure how ADHD presents in girls. Intelligence testing being influenced by cultural knowledge, or emotional expression differing across cultures, or eye contact norms varying across communities. So ethical assessment means asking, who was this tool developed for? Who might be excluded? What assumptions are built into the assessment? And am I trained to interpret this responsibly? Assessment is never culturally neutral. So before using an assessment, counselors should ask themselves, what is this tool actually measuring? Is this tool appropriate for this client? Who was it normed on? What are the limitations? Am I trained to administer and interpret it? Could cultural factors impact interpretation? And what decisions might be made based on these results? And maybe most importantly, am I treating this score as one piece of information or as objective truth? Because assessment should support clinical understanding, not replace it. So I want to leave you with this question. If two counselors assessed the same client and reached very different conclusions, what factors might explain the difference? Could it be the assessment itself, the measurement error, cultural assumptions, clinical interpretation, the client's state during testing, reliability issues, validity concerns? Assessment is not simply about getting a score. It's about interpretation, context, ethics, and human judgment. And as counselors, we have a responsibility to approach assessment thoughtfully and critically rather than assuming every published tool is automatically accurate, fair, or appropriate. Thank you all. And next, we're going to get moving into understanding assessment scores and interpretation.